Planning Commission meeting. Tonight is Wednesday, September 26th, 2018 at 6 p.m. All commissioners are present, with the exception of Commissioners Wickwire and Hampton, who are absent and excused. With that, looks like we have someone in the audience, but I believe it's agenda-related comment. But if it's not, this would be the time to ask it. But if you want to, go ahead and state your name and your address. And if you could, should we wait until it's agenda related? Okay, sorry. No problem. It's my apologies. Since we have no agenda public comments, we'll move forward to the approval of the minutes from September 5th. And once you guys have had a chance to read it, you can make a motion.
Motion to approve the September 5th meeting minutes as written.
Seconded.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes stand approved as written. There's no new business this evening. No public hearing, as we're still in kind of the study session mode for this particular subject. With that, we'll move on to a study session, continue the study session of the downtown plan and code amendments, continued from July 25th. And with that, I'll hand over the floor to Dave Boyd, Senior Planner, City of Bothell.
Thank you, and good evening. I just have a brief presentation, and I also want to welcome Mike Stanger from Arch here. He's going to walk us through the analysis that they've done related to the affordability requirements in the two areas where we're considering capacity increases, in one case through rezone and in the other case through code amendments. So again, this is a continuation of the July study session. That should actually read, oops, pardon me. That should read 725 study session, where we reviewed the rezone of the general commercial zone along the 522 south of Ormbrecht to SR 522 corridor district. That's the bright green area in the map in the upper right. We introduced the removing the remaining downtown transition density limits, which are the orange crosshatched areas in the lower right image. We discussed potential changes to the design review process for downtown projects within the downtown special review area, shown in the image at the bottom center of the slide. And we also discussed changes to the public open space requirements. So just to briefly recap and reorient you all to these areas, the first one is a comprehensive plan amendment, rezoning from general commercial to SR 522 corridor, otherwise known as GC and 522. So in this image, we looked at some view studies. One reason that the GC zoning was retained here is that we got late in the downtown plan adoption process, we got comments from neighbors to the west in the which would be the white houses here on the far left image, about concerns of view blockage down toward the river. And this analysis was done to show that a likely development on this property at the 4 stories would not have an adverse effect on that view corridor. There was also concerns that the development could be high enough that apartments would be looking into the backyards and back windows of the houses above. And we don't think that will be the case. Again, just further orientation, we have Ormbrecht Street at the north end. It goes along the west side of 522 down to Wayne Curve and includes the Sherlock storage facility, self-storage. A couple of other angles of the analysis of the potential view blockage of this. So we chose the carriage rebuild, a potential redevelopment on that site that would have 3 levels above a parking level. So it would use the full 4 stories that would be available under SR 522. General commercial allows 35 feet, which would typically be 3 stories. But we covered that ground and really wanted to focus tonight's discussion on the affordable housing requirements. So I don't have any other studies of that to share with you tonight, but if Planning Commission feels that there is a need for additional analysis of that, that can be brought back at the public hearing. So the comprehensive plan amendment for this and the comprehensive plan section of the code includes the community vision for the SR 522 corridor. And that amendment is fairly simple, just striking the paragraph, the sentence actually in the lower left there that refers to the general commercial zoning, and then revising the map to show all of that as purple, along with the other zones that line the 522 corridor. There's also an issue with regard to uses. These are the 522 district requirements, and the way the downtown plan identifies uses, it's by category. So pedestrian-oriented retail is not allowed in the SR 522 corridor, but auto-oriented retail is allowed. We made a revision to allow business and personal services. I think that was just an error in the initial table that was printed. But it does allow auto-oriented retail, business personal services, some limited retail in the form of what's called corner store retail, which is retail designed just to serve a given development, and office and lodging. And the big change is that it does allow residential, which GC does not. And that's where the potential affordable housing requirements come in. We touched on these use tables, and again, I've highlighted the auto-oriented uses, and the downtown use table borrowed from the citywide use tables. It lists specific uses and then other categories, and shows how they fit into the larger categories of pedestrian-oriented retail, auto retail, et cetera. I've highlighted the auto-oriented retail uses here. But one thing, I don't know if I touched on this last time, but one issue that definitely comes up with this rezone is self-storage warehouses. There's an existing self-storage warehouse at the south end at Wayne Curve, and the use tables for the SR 522 corridor don't specific, or for any zone downtown, don't specifically address that, explicitly address that specific use. And there's really not another use that easily fits into a category where you could put it in. So it's something that we should clarify, and that we should, that we wanted some input from Planning Commission tonight on, is whether we should allow self-storage warehouses. We've heard from some of the property owners in that area that they've been approached by developers, and under the existing zoning, developers, some have been told that a self-storage warehouse is probably the most likely thing that they would do there. We haven't really fact-checked that or talked to developers ourselves, but we do frequently get inquiries from developers who do want to do self-storage warehouses. The question from the downtown plan's perspective, this is one of the main corridors leading into the downtown. And do we want to see a solid row of self-storage warehouses, or at least allow that to happen with the zoning? Or should we explicitly not allow those uses? If we choose not to allow them, then the Sherlock facility becomes a legal non-conforming use. They are currently exploring an expansion, and as long as they have their permits, as long as they have applied for the permits, which I believe they have, by the time this goes into effect, they will be allowed to do that expansion, but then they wouldn't be allowed any further expansions. So that's one of the big issues for you tonight. Moving on, before we get into the discussion on the affordable housing requirements, the other code amendment that we want to focus on tonight is the removing the remaining downtown transition district density limits. A 20 dwelling unit per acre limit was added late in the downtown plan adoption process. Some of those areas were removed in 2014, but, and I believe Planning Commission's recommendation was to remove them all, but council chose to retain some of those areas, which are the ones in the orange crosshatched. Regardless of whether the density limit is removed, the downtown plan does include special height limits and setbacks for development adjoining adjacent single-family zoning and development. So those would remain in place. So our analysis, we've divided this into the three areas that you see here: the West Hill frontage on the west side of the downtown sub-area, up against West Hill, what we're calling the West Maywood frontage up along Bothell Way northeast, south of 190th, and then the South Maywood frontage along which is just 1/2 block along northeast 186th Street between 101st and 103rd. So the West Hill frontage, I wanted to make a correction from what was in your July 25th packet. And in the presentation then, we showed that there were densities within that area that exceeded 20 units per acre, quite a few, and going up to over 62 units per acre. That was a miscalculation. It was a parcel that, it was a development that's on two parcels. One parcel has the apartment house, the other parcel has the parking for that apartment house. So recalculated, that's at 25.6 units per acre. And then I did want to, and we've gone through and we have a spreadsheet and can provide that if you want to see the whole analysis. But the highest density then becomes a 6-unit condominium on a fairly small lot off of 96th Avenue Northeast at 35.3 dwelling units per acre. But a number of parcels are at or above 20 units per acre, which means they're very unlikely to redevelop. In the West Maywood frontage, there is no current multifamily development, but there is a proposal for a subdivision of the one vacant parcel and development of townhomes at the 20 units per acre. That's gone through the pre-application phase. We haven't seen building permits for that one yet. But for the most part, this area has one office building and then a number of older single-family homes also on these larger lots behind, many of which have been converted into office uses, although there are still some single-family residential homes, at least 2. And then the South Maywood frontage is, again, mostly single-family, small lot single-family housing. There are 2 current duplexes that calculate to 9.1 and 16.7 dwelling units per acre. So at least the lower one might be one that would be subject to redevelopment. Otherwise, there probably isn't a huge interest in redevelopment here unless someone can accumulate a number of these parcels and to do a larger development. So I'm now going to turn it over to Mike, and you can, if you want, you can stay there. I keep forgetting that we have this.
So this will change the slides.
Yeah. I think.
Point.
Probably have to turn it on. Well, maybe go to the podium until I figure it out. Okay, there we go.
Okay, hello again. I just wanted to start by talking or recapping a couple of the principles that get us into this discussion and about adding affordable housing requirements. So the whole idea is that by increasing the developable capacity of a piece of land, that raises the value of the land for the landowner. The public has made that action possible, or that extra value possible. And so affordable housing is a way for the public to share in that created value. What we do in the analysis basically is to weigh the value, the overall value of the land and the development that comes from the increased capacity, and then what the and look at different scenarios for the affordable housing and the value that would create for the public at large, and try to strike an appropriate balance there. So specifically on the private value side, or the capacity, overall capacity value, what we look is the number of increased dwelling units that could result. That's a little bit tricky in this case because we're talking about places where there, in the case of turning the general zoning, general GC zoning to 522, there's no residential allowed there now at all, and so we're adding some, so that would be kind of an infinite change or an indeterminate kind of change. So we'll go about estimating that. In the case of lifting the density limit, we're going to look at the difference between the current limit of 20 units per acre and what has been a typical build out in those areas. And then we look at the land costs in the area, what vacant properties have sold for, what redevelopable properties have sold for recently, and then we calculate that on a per unit basis. To contrast that with the value of the affordable housing, we look at what a property owner might make from market rate rents or selling new housing units, and what a nonprofit might make in renting them as affordable units, or what a regular market rate owner, if they were integrated, what they would in essence lose or pass up by providing some affordable units. So that gap between their market rate and the affordable rent. And then that gap taken overall, a whole project, for instance, could go up or down depending on what percentage of the units were affordable, right? So in the assumptions that were discussed in your packet, in both cases, the GC to 522 zoning and the DT zoning, we use a cap rate or capitalization rate of 4.75, which helps determine the value of a piece of land that might bring in return on investment over time. And we used the average market rent for the area weighted across all different sizes of units. So we assumed that a project would have, I think it was 10% single studio units, 50% one bedrooms, and 30% two bedroom units. So we took a weighted average of market rents for those and came up with 1939. Now we treated the two different areas a little bit differently in the other factors. And so specifically in land costs, we found that land is selling a little bit less expensive in the GC area. So we used $40,000 per unit there and $75,000 a unit. And again, this is for the land in the downtown zone. And to try and characterize how this enters into the analysis a different way, if you're giving someone a capacity increase or you're upzoning their land, it can be thought of as that has a density limit on it. It can be thought of as the new density is like giving them new land at the same density. Does that make sense? So that's why that's where we get the value for the upzone, is by imagining that it's like giving them new land. The increased capacity, as I said, we're not talking about zoning that actually has density limits. So in the case of the GC to 522, we thought about that in terms of getting an extra story. So going from 3 stories to 4 stories. And then in the downtown zone, we're lifting the 20 unit per acre limit, but we've been seeing, or we're estimating from what the projects that we've seen, we're assuming that new projects would yield about 27 units per acre. And then,
Mike, I'm sorry, can I ask you
Sure.
a quick question? So
Yep.
under the land costs there, you've got the downtown transition zone, which, are those existing, is this current value
yes,
on the top there?
Right.
So does that assume the 20 units per acre for the 75 grand per unit?
that's it. I have to say that this is a little bit more, or about 50% art and 50% science.
Okay.
So I think that Arthur took into consideration that
But it's
change.
what the current zone allows.
Right.
Okay, and
I
then,
mean,
then the GC to 522, that area that we're looking at, currently has no residential allowed,
Right.
correct? And that, but the 40,000 per unit is based on the form-based max that we can put on it?
Well,
Not the 20 per,
it's based in part on the any land sales in that zone and similar zones that could be used for housing.
But I guess I can see why, because there's currently not housing allowed there, so how do you,
Right.
it would have to be comparable zones, right?
so you're not assigning it a density necessarily or a maximum envelope for development, but you're more comparing it to other zones that are similar but allow residential?
We included those, yes.
There are a couple of spreadsheets in the next 2 slides that might help answer this a little bit. So maybe if you can hold those
Okay.
questions for a minute and walk through those and see if that clarifies it.
Okay. But other questions on this? So this is one that pertains to the GC to 522 area. And there are a lot of the columns in this spreadsheet that are hidden, but the basic structure is to, on the top part under A, we're comparing the market rents to the affordable rents and calculating that gap. And in the case of if the affordability was set at 70% of median income, then the gap for a weighted average unit over time using the cap rate would be 139.9, and that's the difference between the market rent of 1939 and the affordable rent of 1385 capitalized over time. If the affordability was 60% of median, then it would be the gap between the 1939 market rate and the affordable rent of 1165, capitalized again at 7.75, and it comes to 195,400. Then, so that's the public value, if you will. Then what the overall value of the development capacity increase is on the bottom part. And this pertains more to your questions, Roger, but it doesn't show all the surveying that we did in here. But in the we came up with that per unit land cost of $40,000 and multiplied it by a bonus, if you will, of 5 units per 5 market rate units for every affordable unit, and that the 5 bonus units per affordable unit comes from taking that increase from 3 stories to 4 stories, and assuming 5% of the units are affordable. So that's how you get 5, and then multiplied by 40,000 per
5% of
unit.
the total units, not just the added units.
Yes, right. You get $200,000. So then you could compare that scenario to either the 60%, which is 195.4, which is almost even difference there, or the 70% scenario at 139.9, which gives the developer a better balance. The other way to look at the capacity, the value of the overall capacity incentive, is instead of having 5 units, 5 affordable units, 5% of the total being affordable, you would have 7.5% affordable. And then that decreases the value of the density bonus because the effective bonus is 3.3 market units per affordable. Now, I would to go back to your question about, I would have to go through the survey of land sales and stuff that we put together for
Yeah,
that.
and I don't think we need to go through the weeds on that. I guess maybe my zoom out question is the intent to try to equalize the value that you are adding with the value that you're, so in other words, he's getting more density, but he's being required to take less money for those essentially, and is the idea to kind of balance those out?
Usually what communities will do will be to try and make it slightly or more than a little bit in the favor of the landowner, so that there's a true incentive there that helps spur development rather than take the. We want to leave a little bit of a cushion also in case our analysis wasn't quite right or market factors change.
Thank you.
I guess another way to answer that is we're looking to create a win-win situation where the developer gets some benefit of the upzone or capacity increase, and the public gets the benefit of as many affordable units as can be done while still allowing the developer to get some advantage too, or the
So-
property owner.
Couple of questions. First, on the details, looking at the two columns. Now, am I correct in seeing that there are two differences between those columns? The percent medium income is different, 60% versus 70%, and also the percentage of affordable units is different, 7.5% versus 5.
Yeah, that's an awkward part of this display is that the columns in the top part under A aren't meant to correspond necessarily.
Okay, so it doesn't-
You could mix and match, in other words, between, if, where do I put
There is no.
There's no pointer
I
here?
don't think there's a pointer here.
Is there one up there?
No, not that I can find.
Oh, I thought you had
So-
one before.
Okay, that's fine. I was just wondering if you go
You can point with the
to the
cursor.
bottom and look at the bottom of the two columns, the answer is no. They're separate, those
Right.
two pieces.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I guess the bigger question we're looking at is this action, this change in zoning, change in land use planning, creates value.
Right.
And what we're discussing is how that value is distributed, some of it going to the owner and some of it to, I'll say, the public in affordable housing.
Right.
And that's kind of the question before us. Is that
That's right. Perfect.
boiling it down? Okay. Thank you.
Oh, and there's another similar worksheet for the DT zone, the transition zone. This one is expanded a little bit by adding or showing what it would be like if the project were for owner-occupied housing. And here the assumption is that that the market sales price for condos would be $453, which again is like the land price is also a little bit hard to get a handle on because we haven't seen a lot of condo flats built, but in the DT zone there've been a fair amount of townhouse, ground-oriented townhouses, which may sell for more. The overall, the last I checked, Redfin for all condo sales in 98011 in March was about just over 350, I think. But that includes a lot of older units. So I think 450 is reasonable, but you could make a good argument that it'd be higher, which would reduce that gap between the incentives and the.
And Mike, and I think you and Dave might have covered it earlier, just so we know, just refresh me one more time. So like the 8% and the 10% that you guys come up with is kind of a number that you found that gives the developer enough incentive to be able to do the project, but at the same time,
That's
letting the
right.
community, okay.
Now, we could, I guess I feel like I should say that when the council adopted the, is it 12.07?
Yes.
Chapter 1207 to the code, the kind of the framework, affordable housing provisions, they put in there that just as kind of a starting point that owner-occupied housing would be affordable at 80% of median and renter-occupied would be affordable at 60% of median. That's what we were going to call moderate income affordable housing. We can add other definitions. We could also, if you felt like you wanted to strive for something more like what the council was envisioning, we can work with these, with this analysis further and try and see if we can get something that's closer to that. But this is like our first crack at it, what we think is a a pretty reasonable scenario.
And so, just not to get into it too much, but so what would something closer to what the council was envisioning be, as opposed to what you have up here?
Well,
Or
Well,
not
we
that
would-
this isn't, but it sounded like it might be a little bit different.
well, in the case of, you've got the 60%, I think that's why he shaded slightly the 60% AMI there and the 80% for the owner occupied.
So I'd say this was an effort to get at the percentages that were in the section of the code that council did adopt, which, but it is open, and this was this 1207 is kind of what we're calling the foundational affordable housing code section that then when we make these capacity increases, we'll refer to that section. We'll put in for each area what the percentages are based on the analysis that we do, but then refer back to 1207 for the basic requirements and how that's implemented. But for this exercise, as Mike said, we've shaded the 60% rental and the 80% ownership because those are the ones that, the Planning Commission initially was recommending for Nike Hill and South Riverside, and that were included in that foundational code. But it's open to also be modified. We can, along with this, we can modify. Well, we will modify 1207 at least to the extent of referencing the sub areas where we're making these affordable housing requirements. So.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Mike?
A couple quick questions. What's the overall timeline, or what are you guys projecting for implementing kind of the review process and then maybe implementing changes for the affordable housing element?
Well, for this code amendment, the GC to 522 rezone is a comprehensive plan amendment that we want to get adopted by council by the end of the year as part of our, in fact, it's scheduled for a public hearing at council on December 4th. So we're going to be, based on the the feedback we get tonight, we're going to be drafting up those code amendments to send to Commerce for a 60-day review, and then to bring back to you at our next meeting on this topic, your public hearing. We're hoping that we'll be able to get to a recommendation on that at that next meeting. So what we're looking for from you tonight is any feedback you have on what percentages you're comfortable with forwarding as recommendation on to council.
Okay.
And to the extent you feel like you need further analysis to get to that point, so that we can do that analysis and bring it back to you next time.
Okay, semi-related question. Was there a change at the state level or county where our 9600 zoning is, I wouldn't say null and void, but is it being viewed as our 8400 now moving forward, or did I misinterpret something I read a while ago?
And Mike, you might know, I've just heard that there is talk about eliminating within urban growth areas, essentially reducing the least dense units per acre to something more dense than 4 units per acre, which is our 9600. But I think it's fairly speculative at this point. I don't think there's any at least I haven't heard of any actual hard requirements coming down the pike.
Okay, because I know at some of the areas we were looking at, we were going to take it down to 7200 or something smaller than 8400. But if, as part of our plan for affordable housing, we were going to have the incentive for higher density, and now that zoning classification goes away, it kind of limits our ability to offer an incentive for affordable housing in those few zones. But it sounds like it's a long ways
Yeah.
away, nothing we have to worry about.
Well, and I would hope that when that change is made, that then we would be able to, that would provide the nexus for adding an affordable housing requirement there, even if it is a state mandated change. We are going to be increasing the capacity for those areas,
Okay.
if that were to happen.
And lastly, I'm assuming a similar study for Canyon Park will be done. I mean, it'd probably be based on the same general data, but as far as that rezone and planning process?
Yeah, actually, Arthur did do an analysis of Canyon Park when we added the RAC zoning with the 2015 Plan and Code update, and that there wasn't agreement on council to move forward with that. So that capacity has already been added. So if we're going to be looking at what options we have for addressing affordable housing in Canyon Park, but the adding capacity may not be one of them. Although one thing that has been discussed is at that point we added the RAC designation over the entire area. And now through the vision process, we're saying, well, there's really probably a more limited area that makes sense for residential development. There's some areas that we want to reserve for just office development so that those businesses can grow. So we may take a look at increasing the heights and the capacity in those smaller areas, and then we would have a nexus for adding an affordable housing requirement.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it seems like we're a little bit behind as far as the downtown core. I mean, there's a lot of projects already built. There's projects permitted that we can't really do anything now. The GC to 522 change is a good opportunity to kind of implement it in, right adjacent to it. But I'd hate for us to miss that opportunity at Canyon Park too, because we're still, working to figure it out.
I would like to reiterate on that part, downtown, there's a perception that downtown plan added a lot of capacity, and we certainly had a lot built since the adoption of the downtown plan, but most of downtown already had 65-foot height limits, and so when we adopted the plan, we didn't have a strong nexus for adding affordable housing requirements at that time. We do now through the potential removal of the density limit in DT and the rezone.
Yeah, and I agree. And I was just thinking even a reduction in parking requirements for added affordable housing. I mean, there's kind of lots of different ways to approach it, but yeah, understood.
So I'm not sure which one of you would be able to help me with this, but it sounds like we're suggesting that there's going to be a new, the 12.07 is a general guidelines maybe for affordable housing, but then we're going to have more specific provisions, other places in the code, and is that in the sub-area plans, or is that that's where those end up?
Yeah, well, so if we add the affordable housing requirements, it'll show up in two places, in the sub-area plans or in the downtown plan case, in the requirements for those two districts, downtown transition and SR 522. It'll identify the parts of those districts where there will be an affordable requirement, and then reference you back to 1207. And then 1207, each time we add a sub-area, there's a section of 1207 that's reserved that I highlighted in the packet. Each time we add an area of where affordable housing will be required, we'll add that there as well. But the specifics, we tried to get most of the specifics in 1207. So what will go into the sub-area plans is just, it'll identify the areas, and then it'll say, for developments in this area over the threshold, council did settle on a threshold of 5, any development over 5 units. We will require that X% of the units be affordable at a given affordability level.
Okay, and maybe that's where my question is coming, is our required amount of, or percentage required of affordable, is that going to be an across-the-board 12.07 regulation, or is that going to be a spot kind of on each?
That'll be
Area specific.
based on this kind of analysis of each area where we're adding that requirement.
Okay, so there's literally a separate, unique analysis for each time that happens that will go into the code. Okay, thank you.
That's not to say you couldn't strive to make it, somewhat uniform. It can be a headache if you've got, a patchwork all over the city of different affordability levels and so forth.
So could we back up one? And this is just to help me speak to it a little better. So we've kind of identified the idea that we're creating value and we want to capture a portion of that value. I think you also alluded to during the course of the discussion that we need to be careful to still incentivize the action we want. So if too much of the value is taken, you may not get the desired result. You may have a great goal but not get it, whereas if you set a slightly less ambitious goal, you may be more likely to achieve it. And that's, you can talk about which is better to do, but I think that's really the core of what we need to think about is how that value is allocated to incentivize the behavior we want. And I think, given the risk the developers do take, we need to recognize that and leave some of the value there.
So I think I understand that 1207 has been adopted?
Yes.
What's in our packet?
Yes.
Okay. Can I just ask questions about it?
Sure.
In the section of 0704, there's a couple of provisions there, where the city can set the fees, and then the one after that, E, that the city may agree at its sole discretion to subordinate any regulatory housing agreement for the purpose of the owner obtaining financing. That tells me that you can just override whatever the rules are if if that's the only way to finance a project. Is that what it means?
No, it means that subordination is a condition that FHA, Fannie Mae, and other lenders want in order to underwrite the loans. So the city said that they are willing to do that. The other concession related to that is that I'm not sure I remember if it says the standard is 50 years.
It is a 50-year time
Yeah,
limit.
that if the lender requires it to be lower than 50 years, then the city could approve that.
What's the, so these get recorded, what's the there's a monitoring mechanism. What's the enforcement mechanism for these housing agreements, affordable housing agreements? What hammer does the city have for, because 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, somebody isn't offering, raises the rents or whatever, so it's no longer within the criteria?
Well, it's kind of complicated, and to be honest, there's parts of it I'm still trying to get my head around. But according to the covenant, the property can't be transferred without the city first having notice and 60 days to the first right to purchase it, which the city can then assign to an income qualified buyer. So that's kind of the first level of protection. If the covenant then says if they don't give that notice, then the city, at least theoretically, has the right to purchase the home. I have never seen it done retroactively. But then there's the other would be I may be forgetting a step here, but the other would be a court resolution of some kind.
Okay. It's some standing to get an injunction for them to force them to raise rent or to lower rents. And
Right.
okay, I'm just curious because
We have caught,
I didn't see anything in here regarding enforcement, so I just where that comes in.
I see.
Yeah.
It, since it's recorded, most people see it, and they do a title search on it. And occasionally, we catch some going to sale or auction that the city hadn't gotten notice of, and we're able to stop those sales and, redirect them so that the resale covenant stays in place.
Is there just kind of trying to think through it. So if in the case of a sale, you sell it for an affordable rate, and then the owner, I don't know, gets a great job or something, and his income changes, and is there a regular reporting provision for income and that kind of stuff for this, or does the guy get kicked out if he gets a big raise?
Not
How
in the
does that
case,
work?
you mentioned owner occupied specifically, right? Yeah,
My next question has to do with the rentals.
Yeah. No, if they buy the home, then it's theirs for as long as they want it.
So they just initially have to qualify?
Right.
Okay,
Right. But the resale restriction stays on it,
gotcha.
and so that the home stays affordable for the next buyer.
So then in the rental scenario,
In the rental scenario, then they do have to recertify or remain eligible for each time they sign a new lease. And if they're not eligible anymore, then they and the owner have two choices. They can either stay in the unit, and then the apartment makes the next apartment of the same type affordable when it comes open, or they can move to a market rate unit.
gotcha.
I know you asked at the top of David at the top of the meeting, our feedback on, whether we want self-storage units, and I think I'm comfortable saying I don't want any more self-storage units if we're going to encourage housing. And this is a place in the city where we can do it. It makes sense, and we want, we're adding residential, and if we're doing that, I would say not to include multi-storage or self-storage units in that zone, and allow Sherlock to do what they're going to do if they file their expansion and all that. So if we're going to incentivize this, then, and I think is one of the gateways to the city having a kind of a dead zone of just faceless buildings storing people's stuff. I don't know that that's great, even though it's a tough place to build and all those things and access points. But if we can, it's along a major transit corridor, and so I'd be in favor of leaving it out.
And thanks for remembering that one. At the end of the presentation, I bulleted all of the things that I wanted to get your feedback. And so I thought at the end we'd kind of do a little bit of a poll on each of the issues, and then if we need to, we can come back to some of these images. So if there aren't any specific questions about these analyses right away, and there's not a whole lot left. Another of the four downtown plan amendments that we set out to consider is the design review process for downtown projects. There are certain issues that we think need more analysis and would benefit from kind of going hand in hand with some analysis that the Landmark Board and our historic preservation consultant are doing related to historic districts. But one change that we think could be made and that council has indicated a desire to make is changing the process to, and it's a very simple change, just changing the wording that projects will go to the Landmark Preservation Board prior to permits being, and actually this is wrong. Prior to, it currently says prior to permits being approved, and we want to make the change to prior to permits being applied for, prior to permit application. So apologize for that typo there.
Dave,
sorry.
the picture we're looking at there, what's shaded in purple?
The purple properties are properties that are on our historic inventory that have structures that are at least 50 years old. And this may be slightly out of date because we have a number of properties with buildings that were built in the late 60s that are just coming 50 years old. So that doesn't mean that they're on the historic register. It means that any changes to those buildings or demolition of those buildings proposed needs to include an analysis of its historic value and other options to demolition, like restoration, reuse, moving the structure on this site, moving it off the site, and it requires a report.
So on your change and understanding you're saying prior to permits being applied for.
Yeah.
How does that work? I mean, I could see the requirement that it go to the Landmark Preservation Board concurrent with permit application. What kind of information should they have to go to the board before applying to a permit, I guess is my question.
So typically, well, our overall development process really starts with a pre-application meeting. And so at that meeting, a project within this area, we would say, and once a developer has had a pre-application meeting, they could actually turn around and submit permits that afternoon if they thought they were ready. But typically, they're nowhere near ready at that point. And we would say, you're in the downtown special review area. This project needs to go to the Landmark Board. Before you go to all of the detailed and expensive engineering, structural engineering, you need to take whatever we would say, okay, you've provided some very schematic plans for what you intend to do here. You need to refine them to a certain degree and take those to the Landmark Board. They need to show materials, exterior materials, elevations, and the sorts of things that the Landmark Board is going to want to see to determine how well they fit into the downtown context. So it's not a huge step, and it shouldn't delay a developer. It just adds a step, and they need to be mindful of developing their project in a way that would allow them to kind of fully explain it to the board in terms of how it's going to look before they do a full set of permit drawings.
And are those requirements fairly well articulated? At the last meeting, we talked about modifying the process somewhat, and I'm not remembering exactly how it was, but to allow some pre-review before the application. Is this kind of a similar concept?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So Dave, we're having a good discussion here, but is this a good time to allow for public comment with regards to this topic? Or would you like to wait until later?
I'm almost done, and we can come back to any parts of this. So let me wrap up my presentation, and then.
I have a quick question then. So when we're looking at like the downtown core, downtown neighborhood transition district, so we have a lot. In my mind, we have a lot of kind of unique properties down there that kind of relate to Main Street, and they kind of make for a kind of a softer transition into other zones, particularly on Northeast 183rd. So this action that we're not taking any action tonight, we're just discussing it. But should we move forward with some of these things that you're recommending, is there, in your mind, is there a greater chance that some of these homes from like the early 20th century, there's more chances of them being removed and redeveloped?
No, this won't change the possibility of any of those existing buildings being removed. It would, the main purpose for this is to give the Landmark Board an opportunity to weigh in on a project before it is essentially cast in stone. Once a developer goes to the full expense of preparing full set of building permit drawings, they're not going to want to make a lot of changes at that point, and the Landmark Board would like to have their say at a point where there is still a chance to make.
And I'm sorry, I think I might have been referring to the wrong slide, so my apologies.
So the other issues that we are proposing deferring is taking a closer look at the historic resources regulations in the downtown plan and coordinating that with the work that they're doing on their historic district grant project. And then we do want to come back to you with some changes to our Main Street pedestrian-oriented retail requirement, make that a little bit clearer, because we've had a number of proposals that have kind of similar to the self-storage warehouse. The use tables that we currently have don't cover every use, and so there's a certain amount of interpretation that needs to be done. And but we think both of those issues would benefit from some further analysis, whereas the review process one is, I think, a fairly straightforward amendment.
So quick side question. Is that figure from another document?
This is a version of of the figure that's in the downtown plan. It's just it's kind of redone to be a little more readable than the one that's in the downtown plan. Is pretty small scale. So
Okay, thank you.
it has the same information.
You'll notice it doesn't have the reorientation of the straightening out of 522 and City Hall and all those other things, so it's fairly old.
So it is dated in that sense. But there are no structures that would be added to this area by that. But the parcel that we call EFG, adjacent to Baskin Robbins, that entire parcel would be included in the DSRA. And then the fourth of the issues was public open space regulations, and we just haven't been able to do the adequate analysis to present proposed amendments at this time. We still think that's something that we do need to look at. There are also some issues that are still brewing that may affect that. So we're proposing to defer it. But at the June 25th study session, I kind of gave you a homework assignment as you're going off on summer vacations, looking at public open spaces. So I hope you'll keep those in mind, and if there's any particular ones that you want to share, I'm certainly open to that now.
Sure, I got some thoughts. I alluded to this a little bit in that last meeting. It has to be clear that public spaces are public spaces. And there's one that I walked by on Horse Creek that's fenced in, and it was not clear to me that it was public until it came up in the meeting. And I forget exactly which building it is, but
Okay.
You know,
The dog walk area? Yeah.
Yes. You know, some thoughts, are they identified anywhere? You know, we have our parks on a website. Do we have these public spaces identified anywhere? So that if one were to want to take a look, and some folks do, I walk through them, just to know where they are would be helpful, to have them identified somewhere. And, I talked with you, I forget whether it was in the meeting or afterwards, about having walks, and there are various places elsewhere in the world where you can go and look at a walk through whatever neighborhood, and it identifies, certain things to look at. In the addition, there's a little plaque there of the buildings that were torn down. Can't see that from the street, but if that were identified somewhere, someone might come and take a look at it. So for it to be a public space, it needs to have the public in it, in my opinion, anyway. So somehow identifying those spaces and drawing folks into them, I think, would go towards achieving that goal. That's my homework.
Any other?
I will admit that the dog ate my homework, and so I still owe it to you. I have asked a number of people about certain open spaces through Bothell, and many of them have indicated that they did not know some of these spaces were public. So I think this is an important topic we should bring up again. Kind of upsetting to see it deferred. I think we had a significant amount of discussion on it. So I would like to see this brought back. And definitely, I think signage information is key.
Any others? Okay. So here we have my question. So essentially six questions that we'd like to get some feedback. And then we can do that after we take public comment. But just to touch on them, in the GC zone, whether to allow self-storage warehouses, and then the proposed affordability levels and percentages. In the DT district, proposed affordability levels and percentages. Design review process, just any comments on the proposed change that we are proposing to bring forward. And then at the end, I want to make sure to get your feedback on potential dates for the public hearing, either October 10th or 24th. So with that, if there are no other Planning Commission questions, clarifying questions, I think this would be a good time to take your public comment.
Okay, with that, we do have a member in the audience. Time for public comment on this issue. If you could state your name and address for the record, and if you could hold your comments to 3 minutes, that'd be great. Around.
My name is Clev Schoening. My mailing address is P.O. Box 1130, Woodinville 98072. My comments will be very brief, and thank you for accommodating me. I represent the owners of 3 properties in the downtown transition area, 3 apartment buildings that are fully developed, not anywhere near the end of their economic life, but are considered legal non-conforming. And without going into all the nuances of the impacts of having a non-conforming property when you're talking to lenders or to your insurance, your insurers, suffice it to say it's of some benefit to us to have a conforming property. And so I want to encourage the commission to consider that, to take that into consideration. The other request that I had is Dave presented a view cross-section through the carriage auto rebuild for sightline impacts. And I would like to ask the commission to consider asking for additional sightline view corridor cross-sections further north in the West Hill frontage area. The topography changes quite a bit, and the sightlines and the view corridor impacts are not what you would see here. Thank you.
Oh, so could you possibly rein up there? I think we have some questions. Thank you so much for that comment.
Yeah, I guess I was gonna maybe see what the specifics were around your non-conforming, legal non-conforming lots, and that have to do with the 20 unit per acre
Yes,
density? Okay.
yes,
Okay,
yep. And I want to emphasize, the properties that I'm representing are fully developed, not near the end of their economic life, have no benefit from the change in density or unlimited density. But I'm basically here just to support your consideration of
removing the
increasing
density.
the density, which would make our properties conforming.
So that's in the downtown transition zone? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So just to confirm, these proposed changes would address your concerns?
Yes.
If they're implemented?
Yes.
Okay. And then could you flip to the West Hill?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so what you're asking for is a view analysis along that piece?
Well, Dave presented a
Yeah.
analysis in the southern
Southern
portion,
part,
but
and what you're asking for is a similar analysis
in the northern.
in this
portion.
particular parcel
Yeah.
that's up there right now?
Self-serving, my interest would be one through the Biddle property, because our apartments are behind the Biddle property.
Okay, thank
So,
you.
and so you're looking for an analysis of the impact of the GC to 522 up zone on the adjacent DT zone properties at the north end of the GC area.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Similar to the cross-section that you did through the carriage auto rebuild property.
And in this zone change we're talking about, it's an increase in 10 feet in building height, right? Maximum?
Yes.
Okay. Was that your impression as well?
Yes.
Okay. Dave, is that something that staff can do pretty easily, or what's involved in that?
Well, unfortunately, the other analyses were done by our summer intern who we no longer have, so it's going to entail me getting out, exercising my drafting skills once again, yeah. Or my computer graphic skills, which are probably even worse than my drafting skills. But yes, we can do that.
I guess the question maybe is the data available? Do we have?
Yeah,
3D
it's
building
basically
data.
just taking the topography and laying out a site section. It probably won't be the 3D kind of analysis that we had for the other ones, but certainly we can do a site section that would show that.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions for? Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Mr. Shannon.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
So do you feel like you're ready to kind of go through these issues and maybe do some straw polling, or?
How do you all feel? Do you guys ready to go through these?
I'm ready for straw polling, but I'm going to raise one question. On the South Maywood
Frontage.
thank you. I think I asked this last time, and I'm going to ask it again. There isn't really any desire to build more in this area, but this is really just about conformity at this point. These are the last three areas that have this weird zoning, and that's what we're trying to address here, correct?
That's part of it, and yeah, you're correct. We haven't heard from property owners in this area that are interested in redeveloping and are feeling constrained by the 20 unit per acre limit. But I can't say that if we remove that limit that there won't be some development proposals in that area.
Let it just, I just want to state, like, I'm not a fan of the changes to this specific area. The other two, to me, taking a quick straw poll, I do support, but this particular one just, it changes the character of the neighborhood, and that is a concern to me. But I'm also a huge conformist fan. I love the idea of just having uniformity throughout the area. But
I also, I will echo those concerns. I think it is a nicer, and so what is the zone, so it's, is it DT right now, and then it's gonna, what is the current zoning for that particular?
It's DT, but it's one of the portions of the DT zone where council chose to leave the 20 unit per acre density limit in place.
Now, yeah, so there must have been a reason that council did that, I would guess, that, and that these two places, or I guess there were three places, but this and along Bothell Way. What were those reasons?
What we heard, let me pull up the map that shows all three of them, were, well, some of the council members at that time had been through the downtown plan adoption process, and there was a fair amount of pushback from neighbors, particularly of those areas, West Hill and Lower Maywood, concerned about, and it started with the initial proposal, which was to allow 4 stories and 54-foot development in that downtown transition area. That went over like a lead balloon, and so fairly quickly we scaled that back to 3 stories and 35 feet. And it was a very late amendment to the process that added this 20 unit per acre density limit. So there wasn't a whole lot of analysis done on what the impact of that would be. Again, this is our second go at taking a look at it, but it's the first time now taking a look at it with the affordable housing lens added to it, and the prospect that it's not going to be a huge, it's not going to create a huge number of affordable units, but it's one step that we can take to use that capacity increase, which was already studied in the EIS and found to be mitigated adequately by transportation improvements that are included in the plan as well, and get some affordable housing out of it.
So a owner of a parcel in South Maywood, if we take this action and council takes this action, would they see an increase in the valuation of their property because of this, because of the actions that are taken?
Potentially, and I think it'd be a modest increase, but especially since those are all that particular area are all very small lots. Yeah.
So it's entirely possible then they would get an increase in taxes, which would make remaining there more difficult, and selling that land to be redeveloped much more easier for them to take. Whereas if we don't take this action on that area, it's entirely possible their house value will remain steadier.
Yeah, I think the values are going up pretty much across the board, but yeah, there would be less of a upward push.
I mean, for an extreme example, right? If you took a 9,600 square foot lot and said, hey, now you can build that 5-story building on it, the valuation of that 9,600 square foot lot is significantly more at that point.
Yeah.
And it basically invites the redevelopment of that neighborhood, which is, again, I think fundamentally my point with the South Maywood. West Hill and then the other parcel, I really see both a benefit to the public and to the owners, but to that particular street that I've walked down a few times, it's a quiet residential street, and yes, it does transition to downtown, but I feel like we're doing a disservice to the city, to the residents by doing it. And maybe I'm stepping outside my bounds, but that's just my gut on South Maywood.
No, I don't think you are, actually, if you don't mind stepping in too. I walk down that street probably once a week. So I guess I would urge, or just maybe ask the commissioners if you have time between now and in the future meetings to just walk down that Northeast 186th Street, and I think you'll probably get a sense of Commissioner Moreau Cook's a reason he feels this way about this particular block, because it doesn't necessarily even affect just that one side. It will affect the other side significantly if you change it. So I'm in agreement with you on that.
I did want to point out one thing that I didn't address earlier is that the other side of that street is zoned R4000, so that is a little about 10 or 11 units per acre. So just for context. And Lower Maywood is kind of a crazy quilt of zoning. You've got R4000 here, you've got R2800, a denser zone further away, and then back to R4000, more R2800 here, and then I think this is our 8400. And that's a reflection of, there was a period even after incorporation when there was essentially King County zoning that allowed apartment building within that area. And it happened, as development does, here and there, and there was pushback, and they adopted the current zoning or something similar to it, and basically did the more dense zoning where more dense development occurred. And this happened to be a pocket of where there wasn't a whole lot of that, and so that's why it became R4000.
But if a concern is that this is a little piece in the downtown zone that is inconsistent with the rest of the downtown zone, one could also change the downtown limit down to that alley and knock that piece out.
That's a possibility. That wasn't part of what the charge that council gave in initiating this code amendment. There is, I guess, the other side is that as downtown redevelops, at some point in the future, we're not proposing this now, we may want to look at the zoning in Lower Maywood, and maybe that maybe there's a case to be made for allowing more of that infill small apartment building like there used to be under the old zoning.
So David, then could you refresh us on the building height limits in the downtown, and then is there additional setbacks for every 10 feet or whatever? Is there a step back requirement?
It's not there's for any downtown district that has over 35 foot heights, so it doesn't apply to downtown transition. There is an upper level setback. So if you have a general downtown corridor with a 45-foot height limit adjacent to single-family development, it can go up to 35 feet, and then it can't go up to 4 stories, 45 feet, for another 65 feet. Then in downtown transition, adjacent to single-family development, there is a broader setback and landscape buffer requirement adjacent to single-family.
So broader meaning up above a certain height?
No.
You have to go further back?
That just a wider setback up against, so you're not going to have a 3-story apartment 5 feet from the property line of a single-family house.
So let's just say the front yard setbacks along there, they're just one setback? They don't have another?
Right. The front yard setbacks are in the downtown transition are a minimum of 5 feet, maximum of 15 feet. So, and
Okay.
The front yards aren't affected by any special setback rules. It's the backyards where you're abutting directly against
Yeah.
single family zone.
I have been down that street, and it is a pretty quiet street. I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is, the zones of the two sides of that street are not, the density is twice on one as it is on the other, but the form of what's going to go in there if it gets redeveloped is not going to be that different from each other. Is that fair to say? I mean, R4000,
Yeah, so R4000 would have a 30-foot height limit. So as both sides redevelop, they'd be similar in height. The density would be a little bit different. And if this change spurs redevelopment on the south side in the DT portion, and there's not an incentive to redevelop in the R4000 portion, then it'll be
You'd have
more
some
of a
disparity there.
discrepancy between what's
two
existing
sides.
there and the new.
I guess the only other thing, and I'm kind of caught right now in between yay or nay. And so really the big kicker is the potential of lifting this density would be potentially, catalyzing development sooner than, than it might otherwise happen. So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I'm leaning towards Commissioner Kiernan's position of possibly suggesting we move the line at this point. If the goal is affordable housing and not density, letting those homes stay small and with a smaller tax base probably has more in the sense of affordable single-family housing than we would pick up in a project of the 5% or whatever we would get. So we would lose, what is that, 10 houses or whatever that is, if it goes faster. And 15, 20 years down the road, we may have a different feel about Bothell, that might be just a no-brainer to do it then, but they're not asking for it, and it just doesn't feel like downtown when you're over there right now. It's a quick transition, but there's other parts of downtown that feel like downtown, and downtown obviously has changed in the last 10 years with with all the moving around that's happened in building. But I agree, it's a quiet street, and I don't think it's necessary to do that at this time.
Do you want to go back to the straw poll? I think it distracted us.
Sure. In fact, I was just going to ask if there's anyone that is in favor of just removing the density limit on the South Maywood frontage. Okay. I think that's pretty clear direction. I will come back, though, with, well, off the top of my head, I would be inclined to come back with a proposal that does include it, that addresses your desire for uniformity, and a proposal that excludes it. And I'll have to do some analysis of the notion of the boundary change. I think that would have to be a recommendation back to council to initiate that code amendment, because that would be a comprehensive plan amendment changing the sub-area boundary. But I can come back. I'm pretty sure the pre-downtown plan zoning on the south side of 186 there was R2800 OP. We purposefully excluded single-purpose residential zoning. So we included zoning that had some commercial designation in it, and I'm pretty sure that it was all at least R2800 density. So if we did that, that would be the natural thing to just go back to the old R2800 OP, but which would still allow 3-story redevelopment and potential mixed use. Yeah.
I really do like moving the line. I think that seems like the cleanest course of action long term, but I'll let you come back to us with recommendations.
Okay. So I don't know if that's in the order I had the questions, but let me get back to my questions. So we jumped ahead to DT density limits. other than that South Maywood frontage, are there other, or is there support for removing the density limits in the West Maywood and West Hill frontages?
That's a yes vote.
As a yes.
Okay.
I don't actually, sorry to delay, I think we're getting wrapping up soon. Yeah, I think I don't know if I'm quite there yet. I have a couple questions just regards, not so much about the West Hill, but I don't know. I get the West Maywood frontage. There's just very few places in Bothell where there's kind of a cool corridor of old, well-maintained old homes, and there are some along Bothell Way. But I also see that that's quite a big corridor, and that you could establish quite a bit of transit-oriented development there. I actually am more inclined to support it on the backside of the West Maywood frontage than I would be on the front part of it. But I also, it does sound like the commission, though, is much more in favor of what staff proposed.
I can tell you why I am. It's just that area. It's steeper. The adjacent to that turn. It kind of, to me, lends itself to a higher density situation there, because there's a lot of, although it's older homes, there's a lot of concrete that kind of goes up the hill in places, and that part to cut in there and have more density seems like a natural thing to encourage that.
And Commissioner Vliet, when you say the backside, you mean the area to the east?
Yes,
This area
the one
here?
that you said you've had a proposal for, there's that kind
Yeah,
of
here.
large lot there. Yeah.
The large lots back here, okay.
And you're already facing businesses on the other side. I mean, there's already gas station. We all know. So.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess I'm not concerned about that area. Just if you go a little bit further north, there's apartment buildings on that same side of the street. So it seems like it kind of would make it more uniform, but definitely open to discuss it again next time we meet.
Okay.
I'll just also say that I think it's an ideal area for growth because it does lead down towards the rest of Bothell. So I'm actually fully supporting of it.
Okay.
Any thoughts about the West Hill? Is there support for lifting the density limit there, removing the density limit? Okay. And then while we're on that, let's go to any thoughts about the big question here to me is whether an affordable housing requirement should be for 10% of the units need to be affordable or 8%. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Mike, the 8% would provide more of a benefit for the property owner, whereas the 10% is almost a break-even point.
That's the way we're looking at it now.
Yeah.
As I was alluding to earlier, if there's a strong yearning from the commission to try and get that number up to 10%, we could take another look at the analysis and see if there's another way to cut it. But
We're talking mandatory, right?
Yes.
yeah.
How about 9%? If 8% is profitable and 10% is break even,
It'd be an unconventional number, but there's no rule against it.
I personally would be supportive of 8%. I mean, we have to, I think the public gets something from this, and in a way the developer does as well, but that's my own opinion.
Yeah, I guess I'm nervous about making something mandatory and you know, the science and the math is pretty, it's not super precise. I mean, it's an art form somewhat, and I'd hate to stick ourselves with something that's going to basically prevent some of this stuff from getting developed. And so I guess I'd be towards the 8. Or, you know, I don't know, you know, what your comfortability level is in your calculations, but I guess the less sure you are of these, the lower I'd want to go, is kind of my thought on that. But, so I guess I'd go for 8 unless you, I mean, are you pretty comfortable with 8? Or does it line up with?
Yeah, we feel pretty comfortable with 8.
Does it line up with what other cities and agencies are doing, or?
Well,
I know we're unique, but.
yeah, every other city we work with has, there may be a case of a 5% somewhere out there, but it's basically 10% is the standard. But, you know, I think you make a good point.
I guess, want to weigh in one way or another. I think I can agree with Commissioner Cecil. Whatever your comfort level is, we kind of have to defer to, since you guys have been running the numbers and looking at it longer than we have. I guess my only, I don't want to invest a bunch of time going in the weeds, but maybe next time, Dave, if we could have an analysis on the projected units that we're talking about in the general commercial zone that would be changed. Maybe that would, if we're talking 10 versus 15 units, between 8 and 10%, it's kind of a wash, might not really matter, but if we're looking at.
So you're looking for analysis saying how many units we might, affordable units we might actually see overall in that area?
In really rough numbers, and I'm not looking for precise, but.
Based upon 8 and 10, I think is what
Yes.
you're saying, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it is kind of weird how, just on a side note, the 9, it's really weird how like odd numbers, I don't know, we just don't use them unless they're a 5. Like it was like 15 or 25 or 5, then we use them, but if they're 7s or 9s, I don't know.
Except that presidential candidate, I'm forgetting his name, the 999, or the guy, what was his name? Not Perot, no, never mind. It was in the last, it was in 2000, I think it was in 2016 cycle, but.
That's funny.
Oh, boy. That was an interesting one. Let's see. So it sounds like, yeah, I'm kind of deferring to you as well, because you're the one who knows. The one comment that I did take away was you said kind of 10% is the norm. So I think Commissioner Cabe's idea about coming back and kind of giving us an analysis of, it's not too hard, about what we're looking at, and a difference in numbers between 8 and 10% would be great.
Any other input on that? Okay. So then going to the other way, GC, that's while we're dealing with percentages. Here, the analysis kind of showed the break-even point at 7, whereas 5% would yield some more substantial benefit to a property owner.
There was a question or a thought that I had. So this area is ripe for transit. And when I think of families who maybe have below median income, you know, having that option available, I think would be very beneficial to them. So I don't know if it would make sense for us to take the number even lower to facilitate more median income. Lower it from 60% to 40, 50%.
Okay.
I don't know if that's feasible, or even if the rest of the commission agrees with that at all, but it's an area that I think it's a gateway to our city. It's the public transit's right there. It seems ripe to facilitate that lower income.
Over the last year or two, as we've kind of delved into this affordable housing issue, I don't know about you guys, but over the last year, just become completely overwhelmed with how much problem there is with this and how little, what we're talking about is actually going to do for it. And the question in my mind always becomes, okay, well, is it better to have less affordable units that are more affordable, or more affordable units that are kind of affordable, or less And I think it seems to me that's what's going in my mind right now is, I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that conversation, but it seems like really that's what we're picking. Do we want more units that are kind of affordable, or do we want a little bit fewer units that are really, really affordable, that are reaching a different demographic? That's really what this comes down to in my mind. So, I don't know if you have anything to add, but it'd be great if you did.
I don't have an agenda of my own on that question at all. I think there are people on, reasonable people on both sides of that.
One of the things that every once in a while when I'm thinking about this, I look at the numbers and I go, man, that's affordable. I mean, that's a lot of money, and like even a guy at 70%, that's still pretty good money. I mean, it's like, and so I don't know, maybe this is just a thought. Maybe we try to lower that. And this is for just this area, right? Along that corridor and.
Well, we didn't really just talk about the affordability level too much with the DT, but it could apply there. I guess I would say that my understanding is that here we're talking about requirements placed on private development, so development that would otherwise be market rate. And the strategy in those areas to date has been to go that what's actually doable there is to get those moderately affordable rates, and the strategy for getting the lower end of the income range is the publicly subsidized housing, where either the city provides land to a low-income housing provider who can reach those lower rates by saving on land cost. Or one thing we haven't really talked about is the process here is, you're likely to have developments that say you have a 10% rate and you have a 25-unit apartment building that would be required to do 2.5 units. Well, they're not going to do 2.5 units. They're going to do either 3 units and fully meet it, or they'll do 2 units and pay a fee in lieu of the 0.5 unit. And through that mechanism, the city would gather money that then they could use to build affordable housing, and that's the housing that would more likely be at the lower end of the affordability.
And is that the fund that Arch is involved with?
Yes.
So that would go to more of a regional fund?
We manage that
Yeah.
fund by combining the resources from
Yeah,
there.
and that's really helpful, Dave. I appreciate you kind of adding that little nugget there.
I agree with Dave about that. It's also true that some of the cities where the markets have been the hottest, the production has been the greatest, Redmond and Kirkland have started to push their affordability levels for rental down to 50%. And they've done that with a combination, combined with a multifamily tax exemption. So that would be something to explore, even if you started at the 60% level now, and the council wanted to make a push for MFTE, then that would be in combination, and that would make the 50% level really pretty doable.
So a question you put forth on page 8 of the staff report is mandatory or voluntary. Would it be overly complicated to set say the higher level, 70% at mandatory, and then provide voluntary incentives to go to a lower level. Is that anything you've seen?
Yeah, and that's kind of what, well, one way to do that is through multifamily tax exemption, allowing that. And that's in the housing strategy as something that we're going to be looking at hopefully next year. But for now, we're trying to focus on the mandatory level, and then we can, the way we've crafted this new affordable housing chapter, we can add those voluntary incentives later to get those levels down, and also to provide some incentive for developers who aren't in an area where there's a mandatory requirement to also provide affordable housing. There's some issues with the MFTE in downtown because a lot of the early capital projects in downtown were done through a form of tax increment financing, and so we need to sit down with our finance department and really understand better if that's even available during the period of those loans.
Okay, so from that, it sounds like we're giving guidance to do the 60% and 80%, is that right? Okay.
And in terms of the percent of units affordable, would you be inclined to also go for the level that provides a little more of the incentive for the landowner, the lower percentage of units required? In this case, 5% instead of 7%.
I think it would still be interesting to figure out how many units we're talking about here.
Okay.
My gut feels yes, just because I'm really looking to incentivize and make this happen. But if we're talking hundreds of units, well, then maybe that will definitely persuade my decision one way or the other.
And to add to that, I think you're going to have to convince developers even to do residential housing in that area where it hasn't been, because that's itself a risk of going into a new area. So,
Okay. Let me go back to my
The bullets.
list of questions here. I think we're got good. So back to the GC. So we've heard from Commissioner Wickwire on self-storage warehouses. Can we just do a quick round of thoughts on that?
Quick question. So you have your issues. I'm wondering generally what the issues are with self-storage. And my guess is, it's the big buildings with no windows. And my question to you is there something in our form-based code for this zone that would address that issue?
I'll come back to you on that. I think that in this district, if we did make it, well, if either we do a director's interpretation that says, yes, you can do them, or we make it more explicit in the code, I think the best that we would probably be able to do is you see some of these self-storage warehouses where they put a corridor along one side of the exterior, so you can see into the corridor, and the corridors have some daylight, but you're not really, and then, so you either see that or you see self-storage warehouses with fake windows. And I'm not sure that the form-based code would really, in any way, see that as a suitable.
I guess my other question is, if we're not putting it there, or we're not, we don't want it in the downtown core, do we? Do we really, are we required to allow storage in the city?
I don't know if there's a definite requirement, but there are a number of zones where we do in the general commercial zones outside of the downtown core. there's one under construction right now on 522, just around Wayne Curve, next to the other public storage. And those areas which really are places where you're not going to easily walk to are places where it may make more sense. We've also had inquiries about self-storage development up near Canyon Park, and there is one facility up there already. So.
Thank you.
I feel like another big portion of that I think you guys are getting at, or it's just a prime place for apartments too. It's like if you're putting storage there, it's also the facades and the ugly buildings, but it's also a great TOD possibility, right, for a lot of people to be able to reside in. So, yeah. So if you're kind of polling, I would also be inclined to not support additional. It seems like there's a lot of storage capacity there, and it seems like storage units should exist further out somewhere and not in such a prime spot, so close to downtown.
Yeah, so Dave, I heard you say there are other locations within the city where this need can be met.
Yes.
So given that statement, this doesn't feel like the best place for it. It is a gateway to downtown. You know, you're coming in. They're not the most attractive. There are better uses, more fitted to the transportation element there, so I'm not inclined.
I mean, that being said, like to public storage in Sherlock, I mean, I think they actually looked for storage buildings. They look very nice, and I think they are well maintained. I didn't want to make that clear, so.
Okay. Anybody else on that issue?
Not necessarily on self-storage, just one question in general. You mentioned that with this change, and it's not really a bullet point up there, but with this change, we're going to have a corner retail potentially, but going from general commercial, we're most likely going all apartments and losing a lot of retail along this corridor. If people choose to develop and move forward, not saying that that's the end of the world. I think highest and best use of the property is what we should be looking at, but something that we looked at Meridian and 228th in that neighborhood business district was a percentage of the first floor that would have to be relegated towards retail. And I don't want to complicate this process with it, but I wonder even if a corner of this stretch makes sense to have a bigger emphasis on maintaining some sort of commercial aspect, because people living, near the Wayne golf course and up the hill on the other side, I don't know how often they use it, but it's just once it goes away, we're never going to get that opportunity again. And so if there is still a desire to keep some of it, it just would be nice to look at that next time. But
Yeah. Okay. I can come back with that. The auto-oriented retail would still be allowed in this area, as would personal and business services and office uses. So it's not a given that the new development will be just residential, but and there's relatively little retail there that truly is pedestrian-oriented retail. And so and that's what the zoning code, or the downtown plan, really tries to concentrate that on into Main Street and the multi-way boulevard. So.
Real quick on the self-storage. I think it's an essential part of our community to have a self-storage facility. I think it's just the way the world works. But I'm not in favor of supporting self-storage along this area. But I do have just an open question, which is, the revenue from, or revenue or tax revenue, however you want to talk about it, of a self-storage unit facility versus, say, another type of commercial. Is there a large differentiation between those two of similar size, similar nature?
I haven't done that kind of analysis. I could check with our finance department, see if we can get some handle on that.
I don't think it's super important. I mean, I can do the research tonight. I mean, public records are available, but it's just a curious question, right? I mean, you know, if we chose to allow self-storage in that area, would that have a valuation impact versus allowing transit-oriented development? I don't think it's not my driving function. I'm more interested in getting more housing, affordable housing in places that can use transit, and I think that's an ideal location. I do also want to acknowledge what Commissioner Wickwire said, which is we would be inviting housing in there for the first time ever, so it's entirely possible we do this change and it never comes. But I think we should encourage it as much as we can.
And I will say, we haven't received any specific inquiries about housing development there. We have heard from real estate, at least one real estate broker is exploring that possibility with some of the property owners, whereas on the other side of 522, we have had projects that have gone to the point of pre-application conferences, and in one case, building permit applications for housing. Okay, I think I've got what I need on that. On the time frame for landmark preservation board review, I think the one comment I got back was about being clear about what we're asking potential developers to provide at that. So I will look into whether it makes sense to kind of have a checklist in the code for that. But otherwise, I didn't. Is there any opposition to moving up that review? Okay, ahead of permit application. Okay, so that brings us to potential dates for public hearing, and I'll have to.
Before you get to that, you also had another question in the staff report on page 11 about open space and publicly accessible streets. Was that on the agenda, or is that just kind of floating out there as a thought to pursue at another time?
That was another part of that issue that occurred to me after the last meeting, is that there was a proposal. The original proposal in the downtown plan was for a developer who actually builds new streets and sidewalks, they would be able to count their sidewalks as part of their public open space. At the time, the Planning Commission and Council weren't ready to go there, but I think, to some extent, with the Horse Creek development of Horse Creek and 98th Corridor, maybe there's a little more acceptance of streets as part of the public open space network. So I don't have a specific question that I'm needing feedback on that, but that'll probably be part of the analysis when we do come back on that issue. Whether we want to either count those areas or possibly adjust the requirement to reflect that we aren't counting those areas.
Okay. Well, my inclination would be to kind of split the baby and not count the street, but where sidewalks are more than the minimum, I do see a public benefit. So somewhere recognizing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good point. So I hope you all have studied your calendars. My earlier polling, there were two commissioners, I can't remember exactly who were not able to make it on October 10th. But I didn't poll you all about October 24th. So can I just get, is there anyone who's not available October 24th? Okay.
Roger is available, so,
Okay.
and I'm available. So it looks like just one of us. Maybe. Oh, Jason, I don't know about Jason.
And is Jason out of town? Do you know, is he?
That's a good question. No, he was in town today, he just couldn't make it, so I'm not sure. I can't remember if I feel like he's going on a trip too. But
I'm tentative on the 24th. I can probably make it. I just have a conflict I gotta get out of.
Who were the two that couldn't make it on the 10th?
I'm out of town for the 10th.
Okay. So 24th is a better chance than the 10th?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm hearing just one that we know cannot make it on the 24th. I would tentatively go with that date, but I will try to connect with Jason and just get his input on that as well. So. Okay. I think that's all that I have, unless there's any other final thoughts that you want to pass on.
no, I think that was a good discussion, and I really appreciate everybody's input. It sounds like we've given you direction with regards to that, and thanks for coming tonight, Mike. We really appreciate it, giving all your expertise on that. Say hello to Arthur. Do we get to see Arthur again one more time?
Yep. Is he retiring?
Well, you explain.
He's burning off vacation time now. But he's gone from the office for
Okay.
intents and purposes.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back for the public hearing night or whatever the follow-up is.
He did say that he was available on the 10th. I don't know that I've asked him about the 24th. And so my understanding is that he's essentially retired, but he's kind of on retainer or through the end of the year for special projects or to wrap up some loose ends.
This is one that he wanted to help see through.
Got it. Got it. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and. Okay.
Motion to adjourn? Or
Oh,
am I ahead?
we'll just cruise through the rest of the stuff. Old business, I don't think there's any, although except maybe I'll save mine for reports from members. Staff reports at all?
No.
I'm trying to get a kind of better idea of, from the commissioners, if is the email thing kind of working its way out? Are we kind of, I know there's some kind of growing pains with that. It's not perfect, but, okay. But anyway, we know it's there. It's just, so, yeah, if everybody can check in like every couple days, that'd be great. Just make sure you ping it, just make sure it, just to see if we got emails. I had a really cool meeting today. I went to North Bend. I was asked to go, it was the Ruckles House Center. It had to do with the Growth Management Act, and so that was kind of fun. I got to see some people from a bunch of different towns to talk about the future of the GMA and the good things and the bad things about it. So that was nice. I barely made it back here in time. North Bend is way out there. So yeah, motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.